Hi, Dr. Brett. As you know, I am often very delighted to both be patriotic and appreciate my country as much as I am very happy to make fun of her. All of the stereotypes of what it means to be a US American, rock flag and eagle. I've been thinking a lot about the idea of a unique part of what it means to be a US American is this promise of the American dream, how it's both sort of an aspiration, but it's also an illusion. I stumbled across a quote pretty recently that says it's only a dream if you're sleeping. So if you're awake, then if you see it for what it is, it's pretty hollow. And I was hoping to have a conversation with you about what it means to actually achieve the dream, if you even can, and the way that opportunity is a really beautiful aspiration that I think is uniquely American, but it certainly is conditional. If you can afford it, you can be anything you want in this country, but most of us can't. And I feel like, given some of the topics we've been talking about recently, this is a really ripe discussion that we should be having. How our relationship with the American dream actually is manifest. And is this really something that is paying out, or are these just dreams on credit? This is the Doc to Doc podcast.
It's voice notes turned podcast. Place as perspective. Welcome back to the Doc to Doc podcast. I am Brett, coming to you from Southern California.
And I'm Nicole, here in Washington, D.C.
So, Nicole, I got your voice note. And the imagery of the American dream is always a kind of a funny one to me as someone who hates sleeping because of chronic nightmares. So sleep is not this idyllic place of relaxation, but also building on our conversations over the last few episodes. They're really informing one another in interesting and, here's the C word, complicated ways. And one of the things that I started to think about is when I'm in a kind of depressive state. I often describe my experience as being unable to dream, unable to create. And I don't mean dream in the sleeping sense, but I'm in a job and a field where I'm often trying to create things that haven't existed before or challenge our systems differently. And so I often describe that as dreaming of a different world. And when I'm struggling with my mental illness, I can't dream in that way. And I think we're seeing reflections of that at a collective scale, particularly across the United States, living in fascist times, as we've been talking about. And I think that that's probably intentional, where it's difficult to dream when we're trying to survive. So that's kind of where my thought process was going initially, but I would love to hear more about what was coming up for you that initiated that voice memo.
I think my kind of framing question for today, or how I wanted to frame the conversation, because I think I'm going to take it a few ways, is this idea of what it means to be a US American in the context of the American dream, not as a political category, but sort of a lived condition, and what that means in a world where everyone is always watching. And whether you're on social media or you're traveling or you're coming in and out of space, I think there is a heightened sense of what's going on in the US, or there's heightened sort of hyper visibility that's on the US right now internationally. I think a lot of people in the States might say, oh, it's always like that. People are always looking to America. Or I think about that scene in Independence Day where they're trying to rally against the aliens. And they're doing Morse code. And there's this scene where the Morse code gets to a base in the army in the UK. And they're like, oh, finally, it's the Americans. They have a plan. Like that everyone's sort of like waiting for the US to do something. So I think there's that expectation. But I think especially now, my experiences traveling abroad, talking to folks, looking at social media is that people are like, shit's going down in the US right now. So in that context, I have been thinking about this question of the American dream and how that is oftentimes framed as like a core identity principle of being a U.S. American.
Well, and it's interesting you talking about some of your travels abroad recently, and I want to hear more about those experiences, it made me think about in the summer of 2003, I traveled internationally for really the first time. I did a study abroad over the summer to Italy
Mm,
and had the opportunity to travel all around Italy for those like 5, 6 weeks while being centered in Florence. And then after the program finished, was in Switzerland and then Paris. And when we would travel, we would sometimes put Canadian flag pins on our
mm,
bags so that folks didn't immediately assume that we were US Americans, because to situate our listeners, 2003, we were in the middle of the first
mm,
Bush 2 presidency, a couple years after 9/11. The war in Afghanistan and Iraq were underway, and there was a lot of shame around being a US American because many folks, especially if we identified as being liberal or left politics, did not support these international wars that were clearly for conquest and oil and
yeah.
revenge. And there was this sense of hyper visibility of how could you all elect this clearly bozo,
Mm,
and if only we knew at that time, like, stay tuned, we're going to do so much worse than you could possibly imagine.
yeah.
But it's interesting because I think there's this ego-ness around the identity of being a US American. And
Mhm.
there are times where I wonder if that visibility is true, or if that is part of this kind of American dream that we are being sold of, like, we are setting the standard for the world. But having not traveled particularly to Europe in a long time, I'm curious what your experiences are of, is that sort of image validated, and how do you see that being reflected in how we are creating this identity of US Americanness?
I don't even wanna tell you where I was when you were studying abroad because both of us will feel very much, in our age if I tell you what I was doing in 2003 while you were gallivanting Lizzie McGuire style, I hope,
Mhm.
in Italy.
No joke, no joke. I saw Hillary Duff in Florence
Oh my
that
gosh.
summer.
Are you sure it was Hilary Duff or was
Yeah,
it
I think she was on her honeymoon.
oh, I was gonna say, or was it the pop star Isabella, like, maybe that you But I think no, so this question is great, and I would, of course, say that the caveat is that I think it's especially in Europe, it's always, uh it's different depending on where you're at. I think a part of US Americanness, in addition to not being able to, like, name most countries, like, we're pretty bad at geography, would also be we have this assumption to homogenize and stereotype, and being in a long-term relationship with a European, they would tell me very quickly how non-alike Europeans are. So
Mm,
I would situate my most recent travel was in Germany. In Germany, I think there is not so much a sort of like, why did you do this? Why did you elect the Cheeto man? This is unfathomable for us that you would put yourself in the situation again. I think it's a genuine place of concern, in that
mm,
when I'm approached with questions, on one hand, I think people are trying to suss out if I did vote for Trump. But so as soon as I, very clearly, I'm like, it's pretty fucked up right now. The tensions relax, but then I also think that because of everything that has happened recently in Europe, which would be in multiple countries, a rise again of populist,
mhm,
authoritarian, very conservative movements as a direct response to the Ukrainian war, but also a refugee crisis that's been brewing for quite
mhm,
some time. I think people are asking because they're genuinely concerned that the same thing might happen again in Europe or in Germany in particular. The rise of the AfD party. There are too many parallels. And also the way that the US, particularly this administration through people like JD Vance, have continuously lobbied in countries like Germany to say, like,
mhm,
oh, you need to do more of this. This is what we're trying to do with MAGA, and offering that extension of support to really conservative movements abroad, particularly in Germany and in Europe. I think people ask these questions because they're genuinely interested to verify, is this actually what we're seeing, or how intense is it? How are you experiencing it? But I think the concern also comes from kind of this mirror, right? Like what happens
mm.
here can happen there.
Yeah, and maybe an impact of globalization and especially the interconnectedness of
Hmm.
global economies, that what is happening in the States has this incredible, not only just ripple effect, but this echoing effect, like you're saying,
Yeah,
of it validates politics in other places that are manifesting in very tangible and
sure.
destructive ways.
But then, in terms of thinking about this question, also in the context of they just started tearing down the White House East Wing to commemorate 250 years of the Great American Experience.
Is that why I saw a photo of it and
No,
sometimes limit like what I'm actually willing to invest energy into reading, but like I saw they were
yeah.
tearing down part of the building and it's
They're
to
starting it's for the big ballroom, the big fancy ballroom to
great,
host
beautiful
everyone.
ballroom.
Great, beautiful ballroom. Although I should backtrack. I don't think that's necessarily hasn't been profiled as being part of the 250 celebration, but I think it's in anticipation of a lot of celebration. Whereas the Arc de Trump, which is sort of the big, I don't know, arch that they're trying to build, would most certainly be related to celebrating the
Mm,
250th anniversary of the states. Nonsense. We don't need to go there. Maybe we will, but
yeah.
I think this should be a really interesting moment of reflection about what the American experiment has meant for people, the way that it has honored some of the values that were originally embedded, the ways that it has changed and shifted. I think there is a particularly ripe moment for reflection. I think the story of what we tell about ourselves, about how we project ourselves onto the world stage, of how we invite people to come to this country to achieve success. I think being American does have a kind of constant negotiation of structures of belonging. And I think this comes from the founding. I mean, there are people that are aspiring citizens, naturalized citizens, first generation families have often come here to seek refugee from maybe
Mm.
a political structure or religious structure. People have come here for opportunity. And, is this still a place of opportunity? Is this still a place where people can have these kind of dreams that become material realities? Or are we all sort of sleeping and need to wake up and really understand like what's going on or what historically has been promised but never fulfilled?
I think there is sort of this interesting backdrop of Trump as being the a pinnacle sort of embodiment or story of the American dream,
Hmm.
because there is just this overwhelming mediocrity to him as a person,
Yeah.
and that somehow ascended to what he's ascended to. But I think what you're bringing up with this melting pot idea, this is a place where folks have been able to come to live differently, to fulfill their dreams, to fulfill their aspirations in ways that their countries of origin aren't supportive of.
Hmm.
One of the things that it brings up for me where I struggle with this idea of the American dream is, as opposed to a melting pot of ideas, of identities, I don't know what the exact analogy is, but there is a flattening of
Hmm.
identity that is required to become in line with the American dream. There's a whitening that's
Hmm.
required. We'll talk about, I think, different identity experiences, but in trying to bring this idea of the American dream from intellectualized or about it abstractly, I think the direction that you're wanting to take our conversation is this more personal, more kind of everyday experience of the American dream.
I appreciate you saying that. I think that's spot on. I'd like to situate it in my own experience. I think that's where I feel I have the most authority. I'd like to take us a little bit through some maybe cerebral, some scholarly things, just for some context, but not wanting to focus fully on Trump for the entire episode. I think is important because absent of him, it's not a moment in time. It's actually a
Hmm.
larger um, sort of on ramp of critical perspective. So to take a step back, though, for me as a geographer, I do think context is key. Although I love reading philosophy, I think it's a misstep that philosophy has always tried to universalize
Hmm.
experience, and I believe that place and experience define one's perspective. So to think about the American dream for me is not something that I want to talk about as sort of a universal, although I think we will make some generalizations when we talk about it as a concept. But I want to sort of anchor the conversation in thinking that the American dream is not universal. It's always situated in one's
Hmm.
context. And so for me, I've talked a little bit about on the podcast so far that I'm from Arizona. That's where my family is. They kind of all eventually made their way there. And I do come from, I would say, a pretty working class background. My dad, my grandfather poured concrete. My mom stayed at home. And while I had really excellent matriarchs in the family that demonstrated, I think, a very progressive version of feminism, of white feminism, I would say that a lot of my upbringing was very much rooted in sort of a conservative family structure. Mom stayed at home, dad went to work until the family sort of separated and was sort of shocked by some pretty intense divorce. And we started to move a lot. There was always sort of this idea of sort of the nuclear heterosexual family that I grew up in. And gender roles were pretty well defined. People didn't necessarily go to college. I'm not really that far removed from people that in my family still saw it as something that was incredibly aspirational, that we would love for you to go. We would love the opportunity. Or my grandfather got a full ride scholarship to Arizona State to play football, but had to give it up because my grandmother got pregnant and, they had bills to
Hmm.
pay and she wasn't able to work. And so I think it was this admiration for the potential to move forward beyond sort of one's class structure, but also a deep pride in sort of a more traditional family unit. I think in my family, sort of money was tight. And so this idea of like what success could be, or the idea of the American dream, really felt like it was always in the background. And there was absolutely this ethos, which I think is very much part of Americanness, which is if you work hard enough, if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you can get anywhere. And growing up, I felt that. I felt like, oh, I could do anything I wanted to do. I could be anything I wanted to be. Maybe I wanted to be president at some point. I definitely think I was probably more looking forward to being a trainer at SeaWorld with the dolphins more than anything. But I felt emboldened that there wasn't a structure, that just because I had maybe had an inheritance of my family, of where they came from and maybe some of their limitations, I did feel, and it feels very much part of the American sort of dream and the ethos of culture, that that doesn't have to be your story, that there is possibility to do something different. And I think that like that helped me from an early place kind of understand how history had shaped my family's sense of mobility, of sort of being able to move through worlds and make slow progress generation after generation of like, particularly as it related to wealth. But then also because despite my family having a sort of a feast and famine moment, by the time we were operating in that, we were in the recession, and that hit my dad incredibly hard. He had lost
Hmm.
pretty much everything that he had in the stock market, and then there was just no work. And so there was also this kind of growing resentment, which I think is also part of Americanness, which is as much as you believe, like, I just have to work harder to overcome circumstance or to make more
Hmm.
money to like move myself out of, there are actively sort of these forces that are keeping people down. Whether or
Yeah.
not then my dad became radicalized and was like, the banks suck and I'm never trusting them again. He kind of does that. My dad still doesn't want to put money in a bank. He's one of those people. But there wasn't then like any reflection on the system, I think, that warranted action. It was more just, well, I have to work harder. And so that
Hmm.
was my lens that I grew up in. I don't know if you had something similar growing up where you were or with your parents, but that's sort of like how I would situate my understanding or acculturation into this idea of an American dream that did feel
Hmm.
actually really possible. I do feel very much that I love actually the idea of, well, why can't we just do that? We could do it, and that's something that feels very American in a way, but also this idea that you just have to work harder. You don't have to
Hmm.
change systems.
Yeah. And I think this is a through line that we're seeing in a lot of our discussions, of this idea that of hyper independence, self reliance, that we have the capacity within ourselves to change our circumstances.
Hmm.
And it's this tool that if we're looking inward, like you're saying, we're not looking at the systems that are actually controlling things. We're not looking at the folks who are pulling the strings. And
Yeah.
some things that I think I want to come back to is, I wonder at what point the American dream was open to women and
Mm.
femme folks. Because when you talk about your grandfather's generation and your grandma got pregnant and your mom was stay at home, that was the construction of the American dream. Like, the dream that women had was the white picket fence, the
Yeah.
family, the house, the home. And for men, it was their American dream was outside of the home.
Mhm.
Similarly, I grew up for a lot of my life, I would have identified my family as middle class. And it really wasn't until I became closer to adulthood that I really understood that probably for a lot of my life, we were working class. We were likely paycheck to paycheck a lot of the times. And it's because of my dad's financial mismanagement,
Mhm.
his own traumas around money that then turned into his wielding of financial abuse and one of the ways that domestic violence manifests in my family. My mom, for most of my life, also worked. That was some out of necessity. That was some out of, I think she enjoyed it. Yeah, I started working when I was like 13 or 14 in different jobs, and she worked from a point when she was younger too. So I think it was just part of what we were all used to. But one of the ways that I've explored my identity is looking at middle school. And I was living on more of the working class, very diverse racial and ethnic side of a Chicago suburb. And in elementary school, middle school, I was the Jewish kid because there were only
Mhm.
three of us in the entire school. But then when I would go to Hebrew school to prepare for my bar mitzvah, to learn how to speak and read Hebrew, I was the poor kid because I wasn't from Northbrook or Highland Park, where most of the Jews lived.
Mm.
And so it was this very othered kind of childhood or upbringing where I never quite felt in line with the folks that I was growing up with. And that impacted how I saw myself, how I saw my aspirations. But this idea, I think, of the American dream, it's always inherently financial.
Mhm.
We're trying to better our lives, create a different future for our kids. And I've never really been invested in money in the same way. And I think it's because of what I was surrounded by and seeing anxiety around money, seeing the impacts that it had on my mom, and particularly coming to understand a lot of that in retrospect has changed my relation to the world and has also encouraged a critique of it
Mm.
that has come and felt very natural because it is an extension of lived experience where this idea of the American dream has always felt unstable to me. And there's an interesting, I think we're going to get there conversation of the American dream is rooted in 1950s ideology. And it's boomers who have destroyed the American dream for their children and grandchildren. They're the ones that initiated this idea, and they're the ones who have foreclosed the possibility of that dream for the folks that they were supposed to be setting it up for. And there's a
Yeah.
cruel irony in there that also feels very uniquely US American to me.
I think I had put it in the voice note, this idea of like dreams on credit. You're really just sort of
Mm.
promising a debt to people more than you're actually promising a kind of a reward. And it's selective, it's structural, it's inherited in many ways. And we're all kind of signing up, like, sign me up. That sounds great. I don't know. I was really fortunate that I didn't take on student loans until a bit later, and
Mhm.
not a lot, thankfully. But I imagine it's just sort of that moment that you see a lot of people have when you're 18, where it's like, oh, just sign on this, like, here, you can have everything you want and go to college and take on this debt. And you're like, oh, of
It's a
course, that
problem for
sounds like a
tomorrow.
great. Yeah, exactly.
We'll just kick that can down the road and figure it out when we catch up to it.
A lot of folks right now, including myself to some degree, I would be remiss to say that I wasn't, having this critical reflection of what a second Trump presidency means as it relates to understanding Americanness, democracy, all of these kinds of things, feels kind of this existential crisis. But my friends that primarily are queer, my friends that are Black and brown, are, this is kind of just another day, right? They
You've been here
experience it, or
before.
been here before. This hasn't ever really been for me, or, my community isn't like same as yesterday under Trump as it was under Biden. Not
Mhm.
a lot has maybe changed. And that's a pretty fickle way of saying that. I don't want to structure that these people aren't invested, but what I have come to know through some conversations with folks is that what might seem really surprising to white folks in this moment has certainly been a structural reality for other groups,
Hmm.
particularly marginalized groups. And you even talk about one dimension of this of what was the American dream and a pretty outdated view on gender, but for men versus women, and how most of the women in my family were very content having a just a nuclear family and not having to work and not really focusing on family. And I don't want to criticize them, but on the flip side of that, it does make me think my maternal grandmother um, was kind of the opposite of that, in that maybe a little ahead of her time. Like, she definitely would have been a TikTok trend where she like self-identified as a witch. Like, she was very happy that
Mm.
she was divorced and she lived in a cabin that her father had made up north Arizona. And because she just didn't subscribe to a very traditional view on femininity, particularly after her divorce, and was like, I'm just going to do me, people were like, Anita is like such a witch. And she was like, I'm so proud. Every Halloween, she would just dress up in that way. So I think she would have been she was ahead of her time. But aside from like these pockets, I think people really did have this very actual connection also to American dream and kind of what that meant or didn't mean for them. And so where I want to bring this to a point is sort of bringing in maybe a couple of things to counter what we're talking about, which is grounding this also in some historical examples. So uh, listeners, going to drop a couple of titles I think um, are really important to think about how a lot of people have known for a long time that what we're talking
Mhm.
about is kind of hollow. These are dreams on credit. So the first one is a really excellent book by the late Manning Marable titled How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America. So this is specifically speaking to the connection of capitalism and race that has been intertwined. Marable is a historian, and so they're going from the founding fathers through Reconstruction, the Civil Rights movement, etc., to kind of understand how race and capitalism are interconnected, how they're intertwined to sort of structurally deny wealth and mobility or success. So, this idea that anyone can become a millionaire or a billionaire in the US, and how that has been targeted directly at Black folks. On a different level, George Lipsitz's book, How Racism Takes Place, a couple of years ago, was a really popular public facing book about redlining, which is, I think,
Mm.
called The Color of Law, that a lot of folks read. It was on the New York Times bestseller list. And that was kind of taken a more specifically curated class on like why cities look the way they do and why there are sort of these pockets of Chicago, North Side versus South Side, and like why
Mhm.
this is considered a bad neighborhood versus not. Lipsitz is doing a really similar project to that book, the Color of Law, and he does mention redlining, but he's also going through a lot more of just sort of the very visible, often taken for granted ways that we build space in the United States to deny mobility or to deny free mobility for Black and brown folks. And so how whiteness and sort of white people have very, very much created very structural geographic systems to ensure that some people just don't ever get ahead, or that some people never leave a particular
Mm.
kind of place. And so I think those are sort of two counters to what we're talking about, where I just want to be very acknowledging that like both things can be true. People can feel that this is the land of opportunity, and whether or not that is a dream that comes to reality or is on credit, there are also what we've talked about and we're going to continue to speak to of these very real structures that have denied the most vulnerable in our communities the opportunity to even try to buy into or accept that credit.
Those are, I think, two great examples, particularly looking at the racialization of the American dream.
Mm-hmm.
And one more text that I'll add into this conversation, which I plugged, I think, 2 episodes ago in our discussion of the banality of fascism, is Margot Canaday's The Straight State. And one of my favorite topics to talk about is the GI Bill,
Mm.
which built the modern middle class, which is often the tagline for the GI Bill. But what is left out of the modern middle class is that it very specifically built the modern heterosexual white middle class, where a lot of the benefits of the GI Bill were not made available to Black GIs when they returned from the war. They were not made available to women who had served in the armed forces or in support of the military, especially if they were single or if they were in lesbian relationships. And for men who had served, if they were not married, were also not given all of the benefits of the GI Bill. So the ability to buy a house, to go to college after serving, were not made available to the entirety of folks who had served. And so it was constructing a very specific identity for the
Mhm.
American dream.
Yeah.
But it was a narrative that everyone was able to buy into and aspire towards. And so it created this vision of the American dream while not actually being available to
Yeah.
everyone. As we continue this conversation between the personal and the structural, I think we have a lot more to say, but this is
Mhm.
probably a good time to take a little break. So we will be right back. Welcome back. So, thinking about the through lines of our episodes of the podcast so far, talking about living through fascist times, talking about the mental health impacts of that. In one of the things that came to mind when we are talking about like success stories and the American
Mhm.
dream, I think about the way that the Olympics broadcast. We love our human interest stories, and I always wonder
Yeah.
if that's the same way that other countries get
Mhm.
the Olympics, or do they just get to see do they only see the events, the sports? Are they getting these kind of behind the scenes things? Is that what's driving their interest in
Mm.
these events? Where in the US, we love knowing what someone overcame in order to
Mhm.
become the best runner in the world, the best swimmer. And something that's kind of come up a little bit in our conversation so far is this idea of these success stories that allow us to really focus on individual achievement despite all odds. And so it's this way of obfuscating the systems at play.
Yeah, I think we love a good underdog story
Uh-huh.
here. Maybe everyone loves an underdog story. Because I'm thinking about what the equivalent would be. I haven't ever watched Olympics from a different broadcasting or a different VPN, but I think Eurovision, that's definitely part of it, where you kind of have to build
Mhm.
up the persona of sort of why, even if the song isn't that good, sometimes people love a compelling story, people love an underdog.
And shout out back to Eurovision, the movie that we talked about last week. Classic
Yeah,
underdog story. Like they were not supposed to
they
be
weren't supposed to
successful
get
and
out of
weren't supposed to
Iceland.
win. And
And they didn't win, Brett,
well, the elves went too far and we got a great story. So
but also the dude from Russia was great. I forget the actor's name, but he's such a dreamboat.
he is fantastic.
No, I think this idea of focusing on the success at the expense of being critical and thinking, how can we create better conditions for everyone rather than just a few people is really chewy. I study sort of the connection between race and space. Why are we calling that something that's super woke right now? That people are saying we shouldn't be discussing things like DEI. We've advanced enough. Look how successful all these people are. Look at all the women that you can see in the Trump administration or on television, or all the billionaires of color and the women of color, or the women that are now VCs and have achieved this kind of success. So it's a really hollow thing to keep talking about something that we've overcome, that because these people have demonstrated levels of success. Or we could look at enrollment in universities, that oftentimes more women now go to university than men. These are markers that we have overcome what you're calling structural. And yet that's such a small
Mm.
percentage. And I do feel that it feels at least very intentional, that it is still designed to, rather than reckon with and very critically and thoughtfully engage with, is this something that we still need? I think we're at a particular moment where people are so focused on success stories that they're not understanding why either protections needed to be made or why we still need to be critical of systems. And I think about, as it relates to this American dream, is that everyone is so focused on chasing their own version of success. Or there's that kind of that little carrot that's being dangled, that somebody else did it, so you could do it too.
Hmm.
We're not taught to have a responsibility to other people. We're so obsessed with chasing our own dream that we're not there to sort of wake other people up and like kind of really critically examine these conditions.
And I think connecting to some of what we were talking about last week about connection is there is this inherent selfishness to the American dream where it's not explicit, but there is this belief that we can't all succeed,
Yeah.
that we all don't get to achieve the American dream. And so there is this competition aspect to it where we need to succeed, even if it's at the expense of other people achieving the American dream, because it's about
Hmm.
us, it's about our family, this very insular view of the world. The American dream is not a communal dream.
I would take a step back and also say that there are, I think, a lot of really well-meaning folks who maybe have recognized that everybody needs to wake up and have a reckoning with these systems. But even then, I'm kind of worried in the way that this project or this American dream or this like not every this idea that not everybody deserves or
Hmm.
has the ability to become XYZ, which definitely feels part of this as well. Even those well-intended folks, and I'm thinking about I recently saw a little clip of Mom Donnie and Liz Warren sitting down and kind of doing little
Mm.
marketing video for his campaign, and they were talking about why things need to be restructured. Liz Warren, who I think is a really fantastic person, in Congress, and I think has, pretty progressive and well-meaning thoughts about how to move the country forward, and particularly as it relates to like, tax reform and wealth inequality. She was saying, I believe that in America, like what we haven't given everybody is the chance. Like we need to create the conditions so that everybody can have the chance to do something. That doesn't mean that everybody is going to succeed.
Mm.
And so there's always this caveat, even built into, I think, people that are thinking critically about this, where we still have this underlying assumption that the best we could do would be maybe to create what a political scientist would call, conditions of opportunity rather than conditions of outcome. Like you've already made up your mind that the best we could do, even if we did actively work on structures, is still rooted in sort of this very individualized, I can only give you the tools, I can only lead of horse to water, and insert whatever
Yeah.
metaphor. I can only do so much for you at a baseline in the best of conditions. But at the end of the day, it's still up to you to sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps and see if you can rise to that occasion that I've given you.
What is success, or like what does achievement mean? Is it
Mm-hmm.
being a millionaire? Is it starting a company? Like, what are the thresholds for things? Because I think for a lot of people, if survival was a given,
Mm-hmm.
if healthcare was free, if basic income was guaranteed, and we didn't have to worry about food all the time and our rent, I think a lot of people aren't necessarily going to try to just acquire limitless wealth. Like that's not success for a lot of people. Some folks
Sure.
want the opportunity to create or to open a bookstore and just create a cozy little, we've talked about this before. Like
Yeah.
at what point do we just run away and open the bookstore? Like I talked about in the more comment than a question last week.
Mm-hmm.
Like what are
Mm-hmm.
we actually aspiring to if we took survival out of the equation?
Yeah.
And I think the American dream is inherently wealth focused. Even this idea of creating a different future for our children is often around income
Yeah.
and opportunity and yes, access to education, choice of jobs and things. But often the American dream is also rooted in this idea that most of our value, literal and figurative, comes from the work that we do, what we produce, and what we acquire.
Mm-hmm. And we've talked a little bit about utopia, or you've mentioned utopia specifically before on the podcast. And I imagine it's something that future episodes, it might warrant a larger discussion because, like you, I'm deeply interested in this. It also is something that back in the day when I was just reading political philosophy is very much part of the canon. And it's really interesting to me that philosophers, or a particular note of them for a long time, were thinking about if we created the perfect society where people were not just trying to survive, where people were given basic conditions to survive, what then would they do with their time? Would it be that everyone was immediately thinking about what kind of better job they could do, or be a content creator and mine people by selling things, or this, that, and the other? What people like Sir Thomas More and other sort of utopian classic scholars thought was that, oh, well, then everybody would just have this opportunity to suddenly be invested in their hobbies. They would open the bookshop, or they would become a painter, and there would be all this creativity. And I think people have also said that more recently as it relates to, what happens when the AIs take these
Mm.
basic jobs. Well, if an AI can write an essay for me or do all these kinds of things, and suddenly I'll have all of this time to just be a free spirit and go bake and pursue my hobbies and feel very creatively fulfilled. So to me, it's really interesting that as it relates to the American dream, what people are striving for, as you've said, is not ultimately a life of maybe fulfillment, but it's like it is fulfillment, but only through money. And this idea that if you get the American dream, you get enough money that you can do whatever you want. But it usually means that having that amount of money means you don't have to care about anything else, because
Hmm.
suddenly you don't have to care about, just basically surviving, but you don't have to care about doing anything that impacts anyone else positively. I mean, we've talked about billionaires on this podcast. We've talked about why we get so frustrated with people once they amass large sums of social cachet and wealth, that they often just go further into themselves, that there's nothing that they would want to do to sort of make things better, or they have these selective pockets maybe of philanthropy, and it's just sort of all tied to this very self-centered outcome. And
Hmm.
I'm talking about it and it's getting me upset. Why is it that if you reach the pinnacle of the American dream, that you just have gobs and gobs of money, that what we see with people is that they just become further sort of entrenched in themselves, and there's
Hmm.
really no connection to other people beyond themselves.
Yeah, and I think that that is the end goal of
Mm.
the American dream as we've been sold it. The dream isn't about bringing other folks up with you or having the capacity to build community, to use your time off from having to struggle to survive to supporting others, doing
Right.
childcare, doing elder care, having availability to be present in folks' lives. It is about getting to a point of comfort where you can
Hmm.
then explore your interests. And to kind of link things back to episode 1 and our discussion around Taylor Swift, she reached billionaire status during the Eras tour. And then, in my opinion, I know we don't fully agree on this part, put out the 3 most mediocre albums of her career. And so there's this element of like, what is, and I think this is another discussion, like what is art without struggle is
Mm.
often super uninteresting. A lot of artists have struggled with mental illness, were poor. When they were creating, they didn't become famous until after they died or very late in their life and career. And so if part of the American dream is you now have the freedom to create art, I think we are just going to get the most mediocre art we've ever seen, because it has to be more than that. You know, the dream
Mm.
has to be about connection and community. One of the ways that I would describe my experience in grad school, you know, you and I are both first gen graduates, particularly at the doctoral level and master's level. There
Hmm.
was so much that I didn't know. And I
Yeah.
didn't even know what I didn't know.
Yeah.
And I learned from folks in the cohorts ahead of me. I learned so much from you, having navigated a more traditional master's experience than I
Mm.
did. I learned so much from people who had taken these steps before me. And then I saw it as my responsibility to, without waiting for folks to ask for it, just start inundating incoming students with information and data. This is what I didn't know when I was starting, and this will help you get a leg up. And like, how many times
Hmm.
do you and I share that parts of a prospectus document that we were gifted and
Yeah.
then we made sure everyone else had it without even knowing that they needed it? And that's also one of my struggles with academia, this feeling of like mentors that because they were put through the ringer, they feel it's part of their obligation. Like everyone has to run the gauntlet if you want to be in
Mm.
academics, versus this idea of if I struggled to get through the door, I'm not going to slam it behind me so you have that same experience because we all need the trial. Instead, if I struggle to get through the door, I'm going to stand at the door holding it open so
Yeah.
folks coming up behind me have it easier. And that is inherently in conflict with the American dream because we love, like you were saying, the story of the exceptional. We want
Hmm.
folks to have struggled to get to where they are. Yet most of the folks who are where they are is not because they struggled to get there, but because they were given that gift. And
Sure.
there's a song lyric from Pearl Jam. They had a whole album basically about the Bush years. And there's a song very clearly about Bush, born on third, thought he hit a triple. And that's
Mm.
so much of the folks that we see at the highest pinnacles of success. We're supposed to believe that they got there through their own creativity, their struggle, their ingenuity. But no, they were given millions and millions of dollars to try and fail time and time again. And most of
Yeah.
these bozos fail upwards because that's how our economic system is set up, but
Hmm.
they're all snake oil salesmen. And they're all just grifters who haven't been held accountable. But
Hmm.
that's the dream that we've been sold. And folks want to think that they can get there. And like we talked about a few episodes ago, that's why folks often vote against their interests in the moment, because the dream is so appealing.
The people that are doing well tend to do well, but they love to sort of glorify whatever struggle. But I think most of us would probably say you might have started the company in the garage, and that's difficult. The garage is hot. It's a little sticky in the summer. But if you start it in the garage with, $200,000 from dad, that's very different than sort of the way that it's presented of, oh, I had nothing and I built this, again, this idea I only had my bootstraps.
Mm-hmm.
But then I think the other part of it that I suppose to me, because those people, they just piss me off most of the time when I just hear the sort of rags to riches, or I used to watch a lot of Shark Tank, and there was always this hubris around the sharks of I started with nothing and blah, blah, blah. And like they'd get mad at people that came in and that were moderately successful, sort of asking for more than because they're like, you need to like be
You
humble,
need
sort
to
of. You need to sit
struggle.
down. You need to
Yeah.
struggle. So that's kind of one part of it. But I think the more chewy part that for me, because these are the people in my life that are sort of still that I surround myself with, probably more intentionally, or they're just part of sort of my orbit, given where I am socioeconomically and where I grew up, which are the people that if they have success, then, like you're saying, as it related to grad school, they're not holding the door open. They're denying anyone else the opportunity to come in. They're sort of glorifying the struggle as
Mm-hmm.
well, and really having selective empathy of sort of, if you don't like it, do something different, but it's not my job to help you out. And it's sort of this idea that people are so keen on protecting their own American dream, whatever that looks like, however it manifests, however small it might be, or however ambitious, how much wealth they actually have, or how much wealth they want to have, that there's nothing left to sort of defend anyone else's, or even to sort of like, if not defend other people's ambitions or dreams, nothing to build anyone and have that capacity. And I've really struggled with this because I do think it lends into some of the issues we're seeing now as it relates to selective empathy, where people only in this political moment, have kind of empathy for people that look like them or act
Mm-hmm.
like them. I think it
Or
relates to sort
think
of,
like them.
or think like them. And, we see it, well, that immigrant didn't come here the right way. I'm an immigrant. I came here the right way. They need to leave. And yeah, they should be deported to a place that they've never been to, or that they don't speak the language. Because if they did it the right way, then I could have empathy because I did it the right way. But because their
Mm-hmm.
struggle looked different than mine, or their journey looked different, I can't see myself in them. And it is really difficult. I love that you brought up the grad school example because, again, to situate it in what I know, like it was really fucking hard to go into school coming from the background that I did. I was the first person in my family to go to college. I'm part of the first generation of people that actually have received degrees. But then getting there and doing that work and learning the speak and then deciding to go to grad school, which you said, I did take a more traditional master's path. But I did that with a lot of intent and I spent a lot of money. And that's where my loans came from because I was like, I don't know what I don't know. I need to learn how to talk like these folks. As one advisor said, you were a stone, but you needed to be polished.
Oh, woof.
We
Yuck.
know, we know, we know who that is. Wink, wink. But like it took a lot of time to figure that out. And then, like you, my response has always been, "Oh my gosh, yeah, that was really hard, and that was really isolating." And I don't want people to feel that way because a lot of the time I felt super small in these
Mm-hmm.
spaces, whether it was imposter syndrome or I just genuinely felt like an outsider. How could I then create conditions to help people move forward? I do find it harder to understand why so many people then both glorify the struggle, promote the falseness of this dream that's basically like a lottery ticket, maybe at best,
Uh-huh.
or a debt and a credit at probably most commonly. But then also why we wouldn't think critically about how other people could come in with less struggle and have that achievement. It's really hard for me to wrap my head around that so many people are invested in making it harder or glorifying the struggle because that has not been my experience. If anything, I appreciate the people that are like, I did it the hard way. You don't have to. Let's bring each other together to the next milestone.
And I think it's that frame of mind that has made it so easy for me to be anti-capitalist, to
Hmm.
come to that framework, both as a rejection of my dad and
Hmm.
his obsession with money and his seeing his value, which came from his father, of their value was determined not by the abundance of their relationships or the health and well-being of their families, but it was how much money are you bringing home? And also in rejection of trying to maintain a lifestyle with an abusive partner and being really miserable trying to be successful and advance a career that wasn't fulfilling to me. But it's also in one of the ways that I've started to describe billionaires, they're dragons sitting on hoarded wealth where like you can't possibly catalog everything you have. I think about smog in in the Misty Mountain, like you're just sitting on wealth that you are never going to do anything with, that you don't
Actually, he
even.
was burrowed in all the gold. He wasn't always sitting on it.
Well, he
Sometimes it was
was
like a warm blanket of gold.
sure, but like, and you don't know when you're so buried in it. That's a great analogy too. Like you don't even know what's there. You don't know the meaningfulness of these legacy jewels. Just to bring in all sorts of pop culture references, I think about the scene in 1989's Batman with
Mm.
Michael Keaton and Kim Basinger when they're having dinner. And she's like, this is a nice room. And he's like, oh, thanks. I actually don't think I've ever been in this room before. Where you see these aerial views of mansions and it's like, it's a small economy to run that household for all of the staff for rooms you're never going to use with furniture that no one is ever going to sit on. And it's this element where it feels to me like a disease is the only way that I can wrap my head around, like, how do you get to that point? Or it's an illness. But also, I think in this extension of, well, that's the end goal of the American dream is because it has to be fantasy level, where it's so far out of reach for most folks, but that once folks get there, there's this element of you don't become the prince, you become the dragon, and you then have to hoard it because capitalism has this inherent scarcity mentality, competition element where in order for me to have it, you can't.
I think, well, first off, Brett, as someone who has a Smaug tattoo, I feel like that was a personal attack that you just
Mm,
called me a dragon. Although my family calls me a book dragon because I do hoard books
yeah. Oh, absolutely. Do you hear
everywhere.
Benedict Cumberbatch every time you look at your arm?
No, 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 no. Because it's also my Smaug tattoo is the original Tolkien. This is my hipster
Mm.
moment. It's the original cover of the Tolkien like Hobbit drawing. Um, but I do love Smaug. Great, great dragon.
I was into smog before it was cool.
I was in this pod before it was cool. The other thing about sort of this, if we wanted to continue this metaphor, although maybe I'll slightly take us out of the metaphor because I don't want to get into the psychology of Smaug. But I do think a lot about sort of what we trade for this illusion of freedom, or sort of what we trade for the pursuit of the American dream, or this belief in it, especially a really fundamental belief that if you work hard enough, that eventually you can achieve that kind of level of financial freedom or ability to just move in and out of the world when it suits you and move in and out of problems, or to actually not be responsible for anything because you can just leave if you don't like it. You can get on
Mm.
your jet and fly back and forth to Kansas City or wherever you're going. But I think part of that too is that you see these individuals and they all seem pretty desperately lonely and anxiety ridden. I don't want to say that money can't buy you happiness because I think I'd be much happier if I had I can think of a few things. But there is a particular level when it's just about you and your pursuit and you become the dragon on top of the gold or in the gold by yourself, that sort of breeds a lot of loneliness and anxiety. And I've seen that with
Mhm.
people. And I did want to bring that a bit to sort of the role and the focus maybe in white America, or the white version of the American dream. That's certainly an undercurrent right now as we are in an increasingly fascist and authoritarian moment. How do people maybe get this disease as you're describing it? Or for me, I'm like, it's really hard to empathize with the way that people are so selectively
Mm.
pursuing or practicing empathy. Why are people going this way? I've had too many conversations with you or with other folks, honestly, at this point, of just like, why are people pursuing something that they know fundamentally isn't theirs? They're looking at people like Elon Musk, they're looking at people like Trump, and they're like, as long as the economy gets fixed, like that's going to be me in a couple of years.
Mm.
And
And
I don't really,
it's
we're
never
not.
been. we've been
No.
saying that, what, since Reagan? Like that
And
eventually it's
also,
going to trickle down to the peons?
and how many crashes and recessions and depressions have you and I lived through both in our short lives? I mean, I'm skeptical as a millennial, maybe because it's like every couple of years something worse seems to fucking happen.
Yeah.
But I think that's also what people have talked about and thought about for quite a long time, about how that becomes a fertile ground for authoritarian politics, for more fascist ideology, is people turn to strongmen and ideologies because they offer something, whether it is the promise of community or togetherness or something aspirational. They offer an explanation for why you're not reaching the dream, why the conditions aren't getting better, that is pretty much a grift, but they offer
Hmm.
something, despite that it's false, that people really gravitate towards. And I want to put this in conversation with the discussion that you mentioned about capitalism. And specifically, I want to talk about the sort of the hollowness of the capitalist dream, because it really translates not just about economics, but sort of an emotional and sort of existential debt that a lot of people acquire. And I think about this through a member of the Frankfurt School named Eric Fromm, who I've been reading recently because I owe somebody work. It's like academic, I owe a chapter somewhere. But I've been reading this book called Escape from Freedom, where Fromm was thinking about why are people in Europe at sort of the time of the Nazis coming into power? Why are people so excited to sort of submit to pretty unobfuscated forms of oppression? Why are they willing to give up their freedom when they have so much? What is it that people, why do people sacrifice their freedom for the, to support authoritarian figures? And what he comes to the conclusion of, and there's some problems with it, but he comes to this pathology of basically saying what has linked people for a long time, and what you're seeing in Europe in this moment is there are lacks of community ties on all of these levels that history would show us. And I do have a problem with the way he universalizes history of Europe, but that's a different problem. But he says basically we've gotten to this point where we don't have very traditional things that unite us. So everyone is sort of experiencing this sort of individualized, hollow existence. And it's really fucking lonely, though he doesn't use the F word. But it's really fucking lonely. It's really difficult. People only have a way to make money. They only have their job or the pursuit of potentially, getting ahead via a better job or something. And so people are looking to create community. They're looking to have comfort. And so they will invest whatever they have, which is just their individual autonomy and freedom and choice, into people that will promise them something better.
Mhm.
And I absolutely see that right now. And I think about people that like have very strained relationships, taking this back to the personal. I've strained but important relationships with people like my dad, who I don't think would ever think that he would be a billionaire like Elon Musk, but he fundamentally believes that things are going to get better economically in this country under Trump. And so any of the horrors that happen or the things that he doesn't really like, he can put aside, because ultimately, like, it's just about getting ahead and it's doing better.
Well, and I think it's similar to earlier in the season when we talked about where do we draw the line with art that meant so much to us, that to reject the art or an artist feels like a rejection of ourselves. I think it's similar with the American dream, where if that's what has been motivating us, because that's what we were sold, that's what we grew up on, that ideal, that's what we're working towards, to reject that or to shift late in life or whenever it might be is so disruptive that it's easier to hold on to that dream, that vision, because there's something comforting in it, even though we know it's a lie. I brought up the Matrix analogy, I think a few episodes ago, where waking up from the Matrix is painful. And if given the choice to wake up, but to live in a beige reality where you're eating gruel, or to stay in this ideal that is fake, it's a tough choice. And the Matrix analogy is not one-to-one, I think, in this discussion, because we're somewhere in between. We know that we're living a lie. I think a lot of folks know it because they've, like you said, have been experiencing the recessions. We see the grift in different ways and are choosing. We keep coming back to this idea of choosing how we engage with power and how we engage with systems. And there is something comforting about having the horizon of the American dream to look towards than trying to live fundamentally different, but we don't have that alternative dream in a collective sense. So holding on to what we know is comforting.
When I think about the American dream, I think that the most cynical version of myself, through my experience, through my shared experience with other people, of trying to sit here and put on my critical cap and just sort of hating it and wanting to tear it all down, is that part of the American dream, part of being a US American, is this ethos of sort of you can sell your soul for comfort, right? Anything to get ahead. And that's a cynical version. But on the other hand, I think there is something really beautiful about sort of striving, or this idea that is embedded in it. I think to connect this to where I started to about travel, something that is genuine is I do think people still believe, despite everything that's going on, that the US is a place that you go to if you want to try something out, and that people
Mm.
really do admire about US Americans. I think that we have a very entrepreneurial view on the world. I would be lying if I didn't sit there and say, I like that I grew up thinking that I could do anything, including being a dolphin trainer at SeaWorld, despite everything that we know about blackfish. And also I have no scientific aptitude. Biology is not my strong suit. But I think that there's something really beautiful to that, especially when you compare it to other systems that in their own cultural context still have a lot of restrictions, and not everybody has that promise. It's
Yeah.
not structurally guaranteed, and so people still come here for that reason. For me, thinking about both things, being critical and being really cynical and saying I want to burn it down, but also admiring the aspirational part of it. A lot of what we've talked about is just the way that these things become so individualized. And I really feel that the way that moving forward, if we were to have a critical reckoning and to think about this together, the togetherness is the key.
And I think connection is key. Togetherness is what it's all about. I think we will continue to talk about that idea throughout the podcast related to different topics, but this is probably a good opportunity to take a quick break and come back to our closing segment, More Comment Than a Question. Back to the Doc to Doc podcast. We are going to conclude this episode, as we conclude every episode, with a little segment we lovingly call More Comment Than a Question, where we share something that's on our mind and we will not be taking follow-ups. So Dr. Nicole, you know this because I texted you while it was going on, but we're in spooky season. I love Halloween. I love the vibes. It's always a little bit spooky season for me, but I actually don't like scary movies. I don't like horror. I don't like things that are overly violent or mean, but I do like the spooky vibes.
Mm-hmm.
Love me some Nightmare Before Christmas, Hocus Pocus 1 and 2, Goosebumps, starring everyone's favorite Jack Black. And so this was the year I was looking for something a little bit different. And this was the year I decided, you know what? I'm going to watch Twilight. And I'd never seen it. I'm a little bit older than the generation that read the books. So it just was not significant to my pop culture life and reality. And just never saw them.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided I'm going to dive in, and oh goodness, are they fantastic. And I had to text a friend, my two friends from Minnesota, who I know have seen the movies. And I was like, this is a comedy, right? Because I am cackling. It is ridiculous. And I know some of it is special effects of the time, but I'm also just it is so absurd. The dialogue is ridiculous in a great campy way that's not intentional, as the best camp often is. And then I think I've finished 1 and 2. I don't think I've started 3 yet. At some point, I believe at the beginning of episode 2, I asked my friends, or I made a comment about just how awful Edward is. And my friend says, oh, joke's on you. No one hates Edward more than Edward. And I said, challenge accepted. And she was like, well, basically that's what this entire movie is about, is how much Edward hates himself. And I replied, oh, there's plot in between all of the brooding at one another. Fantastic film. I am greatly enjoying this experience. I wish that I had someone else watching me with it actively, because it feels like I'm living out an episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000, where I'm the audience and the commentators all in one, and I'm having a great experience. Whether or not I will watch these ever again as part of my spooky season viewings, I don't know, but on potentially first and only view, quite enjoyable. I will not be taking follow-ups.
This is weird. This sucks. We've trapped ourselves in a format. Okay, my more of a comment than a question. If you're listening to this, folks, I can barely contain. I have so many responses, but my more of a comment than a question this week is, like you, Dr. Brett, it is spooky season. I am too watching spooky movies. I don't mind the scary genre, but I am definitely one of those people that watches things. I like to watch it with someone and kind of watch it through a crocheted blanket that has lots of little teeny tiny holes that I can kind of watch through when it gets scary. But I recently rewatched Scooby-Doo 1 and 2, the live actions. And my more of a comment than a question is kind of twofold, that Scooby-Doo 1 is a perfect film, and I will not be taking follow-ups. It is so good. It is a cinematic masterpiece. Spooky Island is a vibe. Everything about that film is perfect. But I rewatched Scooby-Doo 2, and I haven't seen it in a while. And it was so bad. And it just kind of made me think about all of the upcoming reboots. I watched for the first time Beetlejuice, the new reboot. I haven't seen Hocus Pocus 2, but generally I am like, why do we keep doing this? We keep doing these subpar reboots. And so I just wanted to say that a perfect film is Scooby-Doo 1, but a not so good reboot is Scooby-Doo 2. But I still own both of them. I guess I'll watch the second one. But reboots, man, sometimes we just need to say, we did it, y'all. We mission accomplished, a la George Bush on that aircraft hangar, and just leave it there. So.
As you said, I think we did structure ourselves into a corner in not being able to respond to one another, but that is the segment as it is intended.
Yeah, I had to put a little George Bush in there that you couldn't respond to on purpose.
Thank you all for listening. As always, please smash that like and subscribe button. Follow us on all the social medias at Doc2Doc Pod. As always, we will include some links to different things that we talked about today, including the books and additional information in the show notes. Interestingly, next episode may actually be an opportunity, Dr. Nicole, for you to talk about some of your thoughts on Twilight, because we will be building on this conversation around the American dream and specifically talking about relationships in capitalist and fascist times, the mediocrity of men, and all sorts of related things. Talk to y'all next week.
Can't wait. I wish I had a Team Cullen t-shirt that I could wear in solidarity with next week's topic.
I was Team Wolf Boy, and then he cut his hair, and I was like, I don't like you anymore.
Where you been, Loca? Where you been? See you all next week, folks. The Doc2Doc podcast is written and hosted by us, Dr. Nicole K. Mayberry and Dr. Brett S. Goldberg. Coincidentally, we're also the producers. Our music was written, produced, and performed by Matt Bogdanow, and our podcast art was illustrated and designed by Andre Gonzalez. For more, you can follow us on the platforms where you get your podcasts, or you can follow us on social media at Doc2Doc Podcast.